modern materialism has reduced the complexity of life, its aliveness to sums and parts, and has deprioritized the human inner world. And that has led to a big breakdown. And a livable future will demand a new paradigm to be rooted in the understanding of the whole, not just parts, but also how they play together. And so something is emerging. Like we can sense it in the space. There is this desire to birth a new future that's coming from many different spaces and communities and individuals. But we want to also kind of say, so what kind of views and value might underpin a wiser, weller world?
Welcome to the Soul Awakened Leadership Podcast. Soul Awakened leaders are courageous innovators and pioneers who embody a deep knowing of our interconnectedness and operate from a mindset of co-creation in service to all of life. They surrender their existence completely to a higher organizing principle that is leading them beyond separation and competition and opens up the potential for an entirely new way of being on this planet in a time of metamorphosis. In this podcast, I share cutting-edge perspectives and invite the voices of leaders who don't create followers but inspire others to step into their true power and essence. And today I'm in conversation with Sylvie Barbier, who not only very eloquently analyzes our current situation and shares her perspective of an integral systems change approach that includes both the inner consciousness change and the pragmatic implementation on the marketplace. She also very openly shares from her personal experience of how she moved through times of darkness before stepping into the light, and how this personal reference is representative to the paradigm shift we're going through as a culture, which she refers to as the potential and movement of a second renaissance. Before we begin, I want to announce that you can still apply for the Soul Awakened Leadership Circle group coaching program that I'm offering again. It is a curated support structure for pragmatic visionaries who are committed to deep inner work while being actively engaged in the world by bringing their gifts fully to the marketplace in service to life. Described by former participants as a deeply transformative experience and something that I haven't really been exposed to ever, this is a group of allies that comes together to uplevel each other for what's to come. If you want to find out more or apply, you can find all the details at soulawakenedleadership.com. And now let's get started with Sylvie Barbier. Enjoy this conversation. Welcome, Sylvie. I've been following the work of Life Itself for a while, even when I still lived in Berlin, and I've been inspired especially by the recent activity of the project that you co-founded, the Second Renaissance. And so I've just at some point cold emailed you. That's how we got to know each other basically, and asked if you were open for a conversation, which we had just a week ago. And I immediately had that impulse to open up this dialogue for a wider audience and continue our exchange in this podcast format. And I'm especially excited about our conversation today because I see myself very much focused on this bottom-up consciousness development on an individual level as a coach, and also looking from a more top-down systemic level at how to bring together investors and regenerative projects in a new way of thinking and collaborating more in ecosystems and bioregional networks in service to life. And this week I had an interesting coaching session with a musician, and I realized that her work is at least as important to impact this field of global consciousness by working on a more energetic and frequential level that touches people deeply. So it's less linear seemingly and less pragmatic than the work that I'm doing, but maybe because of that, even more powerful. And I know that you are very passionate also about the transformative power of art. And so I'm really curious to dive a little deeper into that topic with you in a moment. From the little that I know of you, you have a very interesting biography of not just bridging different cultures in terms of your native background, but also in the fields of work that you've been combining, that you've invested yourself in. And you're an artist and you have been working in that field for several years. And with Life Itself, you started 2 community hubs, co-living spaces in Germany and France, and also linked to that a very vibrant international community of online connections and collaborators. And I'm sure there's so much more to say about you. So let me just start again by welcoming you warmly and asking you to share anything that you feel is important to know about you at this point, to get a little bit more about where you're coming from as a human being and with your contribution in this time. And also what would make this good hour that we have together now valuable for you.
Thank you very much for welcoming me. And I would like to say also welcoming us because I don't come just as myself. I also come as a representative of life itself and Second Renaissance. But to get really specific, maybe people here who don't know me or who are listening to us might wonder who I am. So I'm Sylvie Barbier. I'm half French, half Taiwanese. I'm based in France and I'm the co-founder of Life Itself. And as you said, we've set up several hubs and we um, are basically a collective of pragmatic utopians seeding a second renaissance for a radically wiser, well world. And that seems maybe very grandiose. And maybe what's particularly about us is that we're a combination of engaged in the world and doing the inner work of
Mm.
wanting outer service and inner transformation, being intellectual and spiritual, and weaving polarities of being rigorous and creative, presence, purpose, and practice. So that would be kind of our flavor. And I guess maybe what's interesting is I think it's this kind of combination is this helix of these different things that makes our flavor.
Mm. Beautiful. I love that. Yeah, and you pointed a little bit to that seed early. My sense is that successful projects not only have a strong source like you and your partner, but also um, yeah, like a clear seed that is present from the beginning, like a first fractal on the essence that gets then replicated and scaled as the project evolves. And how you're presenting it, it makes so much sense, but I can imagine that it wasn't always this clear at the beginning. So I'm curious if you want to take us back a little into the history of the project. What was this initial impulse, the seed for life itself, and how did it first manifest? What's the first prototype, and how did it unfold and blossom since then?
So our first manifesto was written in November 2015. So we've been around for about almost 9 years.
Mm.
Um, I think that also speak to robustity. You know, we've seen things,
Mm-hmm.
had some experiences, and hopefully gain some wisdom out of those experiences. Um, some of the seeds, well, it came from an encounter between myself and Rufus Pollock, and then from that also grew another co-founder, Liam Kavanagh, and which I guess is a deep question around what is wisdom, uh, how, and really a sense of like basically, which is the beginning of basically the second Renaissance, which we're trying to put forward our theory of change. We always had that sense of like basically something's really wrong, something's not working as well as we'd like it to.
Mm.
And different people might come to that conclusion from different ways. From for me, it was really coming from a sense of like the disconnection of the city life. You know, I lived in London and people were waking up in a room, which is a house, it's a box, and then they would go into another box, which is a bus. They would go into another box, which was the tube, and then they would go into another box, which was the building in which they worked. And then you go back to the tube and in another box, and then you end up dead in a box. And that felt very bizarre. And I was like,
Mm.
something's really wrong here.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and there was also, then there was maybe already that sense of like something's not right, climate change. You know, now we're talking about climate crisis. Um, and actually, really, the one key thing is wanting to have a deep and accurate diagnosis. Uh, because
Mm.
otherwise, if you're treating the superficial symptoms, it won't be enough. That we have to go to the underlying cause of why is something wrong. And
Mm-hmm.
uh, and our sense was that it has to come from our culture, the foundations of our civilization, which are our shared views and values. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
little bit like the waters, the fish in the water. And being mixed race, I had this opportunity to kind of like experience at a young age many different types of waters. I grew up in the West in France, but I was born in Taiwan and I would go back very regularly. And I also spent some time in the Sahara with the nomads. And so you really sense like there's very different waters, different cultures. But when you only spend most of your life in one, that just becomes your normality. Um, so, like waters to a fish, the views and values we live by are often invisible to us, and yet they shape our way of thinking, our way of being, what we prioritize, what we think is possible, what we would dismiss, and what we think is normal.
Mhm.
And I guess the sense of the breaking down of something's not right is that the paradigm, the paradigm in which we live started to kind of break down, started to show kind of cracks, the dream of modernity that I grew up with. My father would say, you'd be better off than me. The more you have, the more you'll be happy. It just kind of seems not really right. Um,
Mm.
and so it was kind of then going to the root. Okay, what is at the root of the paradigm of that water we swim in, of that paradigm we're part of? Uh, and it's kind of very uncomfortable, that process, because we're very attached to it, because we often identify with it. And I would say, for example, one is the value of individualism and
Mm.
progress and rationality. And so, for example, individuality, like my father would always say, you unique, like that would, oh, I'm unique, I'm special, right? Compared to when I would go to Taiwan, there was a lot less that sense of like the need to be unique. Uh,
Mm.
Progress. Oh, we would do better than our ancestor. Each generation has done better than the past one, which is wonderful to sense, but like, have we always done better? Like, can we keep,
Mm.
having more? Can we keep growing? Because progress and growth goes together. Like climate crisis kind of confront that with that kind of value system. Um,
Mhm.
like rationality felt sometimes very constraining. I'm very creative. I mean, I imagine a lot of people here might have experienced that, or so. Like, you got to fit in that box, and it's very suffocating. Uh, Freedom was wonderful. Like I like being her friend was like also freedom as one of the key value. And I don't know for you, but like freedom became sometimes huge of anxiety, because I was like, oh my God, I have all this
Mm.
freedom, but what do I want? Where should I
Mhm.
go? Who should I be? What should I do? It's like, what do I do if like I should have the freedom to have everything I want? And
Mhm.
different from freedom from being yourself. Um, anyway, I could go on, and equ- equality and all these things. We want, like, for me, what has been important is acknowledge like that has brought a lot of wonderful things, that it has brought progress in certain dimensions, in, for example, our individual liberty and the material progress, that women don't die in childbirth thanks to modern medicine as much as we used to. However, that these ideas also have a shadow, that this endless
Mm.
growth, materialism, and solutionism is an addiction to kind of wanting things to be certain and controllable. And they're also behind, driving global exploitation when we see pictures of forests being decimated, the destruction of nature, that sense of loneliness and nihilism. There's no God, anything, nothing matters. So whatever.
Mhm.
Uh, and there just seems to be like, oh my God, we might be really smart, but are we wise? Not so
Mhm.
sure.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, and so of course, like for example, second renaissance uh, is kind of like some of the key theory of change. It's not like where everything is new that we came up with. There's influence from integral. There's also influence from Joanna Macy's, from
Mm.
metamodern. We're not claiming like, oh, we're the only one. We take inspiration, but
Mhm.
one key thing is we want to make that message really simple and clear and accessible.
Mhm.
And the other thing is we have a sense that, hey, if we want to, like, again, there's an illness, you want to go to the root. And so the solution has to go to the root, that we can't address this
Mm-hmm.
crisis only for the same logic and system that gave birth to these problems.
Yeah.
And so we need to be quite radical, and the
Mm-hmm.
radical sense is going to the root in that sense. And so
Yeah.
we need a profound shift in our ways of being, thinking, feeling, acting,
Mm-hmm.
and for a new emergence of a new paradigm that
Mm-hmm.
transcends modernity.
Beautiful.
And
Yeah.
the thing is, like, views and values can change, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
has happened in the past. We have seen it happen. Um, and they things can transcend old ideas. Now they might happen over generations
Mm-hmm.
versus like a short span, but it's possible. And however, I think what is important is that I like to talk maybe about darkness before dawn, like a dark renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I don't know for you, but like I know that sometimes we only take steps for change once we hit a bit bottom rock,
Mm-hmm.
once in
Mm-hmm.
a lot of suffering. And
Yeah.
similarly, collectively, we might only take real change um, only if we encounter suffering. Now, I hope we don't have to go through, deep extent of system collapse and deep, deep breakdown and civilization collapse. And we have seen that in the past that this is often a certain kind of pattern. Um, and that doesn't mean that there's no hope, regardless of the darkness that might come with that transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
There's so much in what you're saying that I just want to pause for a minute because I know that there's so much more to explore, but I just want to resonate this idea of how important it is to be aware that the current dominant culture isn't the only culture. And oftentimes, in order to experience that, we need to have a reference of like, oh, it could be different in order to recognize what has been so natural for us all the time. And for me, to recognize how deeply colonialized my mind with this Western idea still was, despite so much inner work and so much spiritual practices, was when I came to Costa Rica and realized that I was living a very different lifestyle than I was living in the city. So I can very much relate to this image of living in these boxes. And I was doing very little work. There were times where I was just not doing anything, honestly. And yet I was so blessed with abundant fruits and warmth and community and connection. And I felt I have everything that I need in order to thrive. And yet I'm not working. And that was a big contradiction for me already to the beliefs that I somehow still consciously weren't even holding anymore, but subconsciously were still active within me. So I resonate very much with this approach of really going to the root of what is the worldview that is shaping our relationship with reality. And if we shape that worldview that is represented in our individual consciousness, but also in our culture, then we can actually have a more precise diagnosis of what's actually going on. And as you say, from my own experience, I resonate very much with the cycle of having to move through crisis in order to have this opening again that brings the certain necessity for change. And I share the hope that maybe at this point we don't have to go through a big civilizational collapse, but we can move into a more, let's say, conscious evolution where more and more people have had that experience in their inner world and have confronted this darkness in their inner world so that we don't have to replicate it on the outside.
yes, yes, I deeply hope so too. Um, and that's also why we want to do this work of sharing that something else is possible. Because I also think that one tendency is when you don't see a future possible, there's a tendency to want to hold on to
Mm-hmm.
what known, to hold on to the past. And there's a
Yeah.
need to mourn, to grieve, to make our amends, to see how much, you know, maybe also how much we are like our ancestor, how much those paradigms are still in us, and to not
Mm-hmm.
so make it wrong, but wanting to see the possibility of evolution, of
Yeah.
conscious evolution,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and that it's something that is done through generation, to see ourselves as, instead of a cog in a machine, like that you're one ancestors that is then transmitting, doing your part of the job, your part of the transformation, your part of awareness and consciousness. And yes, like that, the basically we really need a new regenerative paradigm, because modern materialism has reduced the complexity of life, its aliveness, to sums and parts, and has deprioritized the human inner world. And that has led to a big breakdown. And a livable future will demand a new paradigm to be rooted in an understanding of the whole, not just parts, but also how they play together. And so something is emerging. Like we can sense it in the space. There is this desire to birth a new future that's coming from many different spaces and communities and individuals. But we want to also kind of say, so what kind of views and value might underpin a wiser, weller world? Because and this is our theory. We're not saying should be the only one. There might be a variety and some difference, but we're pinning like these statements are our position. And for us, those views and values is one, prioritizing inner growth instead of material growth. The way it was just like, oh, I can just have 5 cars and another TV and 10 homes. It's like, oh, how much can I grow in my inner being, in my consciousness, that I can wake up, grow up, and I can clean up my shadows, my resignation, and I can show up as a citizen, and to have a recognition that human being evolve. We don't just grow until we're like 20 something and then we're set, like, no, there's still potential for us to continue to grow. That also wisdom is a renewed cultivation of wisdom based on the understanding of the limits of reason. So it's not either also throwing the baby with the bathwater, saying, oh, hell with science and reason and rationality. It's just so oppressive. It's like, oh, we prioritize wisdom, and to be wise, it does include being able to use reason and rationality, and it's limited. And wisdom has a dimension of like seeing things as a whole, having things in long term, and includes all living. Does not include only human beings, but it includes all that is living. Our third one would be interbeing, and is to see profoundly the interdependent relationship that we have with each other and the planet. That there's a regenerative and ecological connection. And how would we live with that as a value? It's still very emergent. It's like, not defined. We have to experiment. It's really it's not something we're yet completely living into. It's not a water we're in. It's something emerging. Also, spirituality, going beyond secularity and reintegrate spirituality and religion in our collective life. Now, I want to talk a little bit about that, because sometimes there is also a bit of reactivity that can come when we talk about religion, because there's so much trauma, collective trauma about religion related to dogmatism, like being evangelical and imposing on others. But what I mean by religion is like I aim to heal that word, because religion is to relink, to link together. Religion. Re is again lié, to link, and gion is like together. And it's like, to practice our spirituality together, to not just practice as an individual, to practice with others what connects us to something bigger than ourselves. And we can put safeguards in terms of like, watching to not become dogmatic. And that's something that in modernity did throw the baby with the bathwater. It did throw religion and spirituality out, and it disconnected us. And okay, the way we would like to not throw rationality in the next step, we also want to like heal and recuperate parts of the spiritual realm. And finally, it's also beyond capitalism. the way that modernity had a new economical model that went beyond feudalism with capitalism. And it was a huge step forward to no longer be serf to your king.
Mm-hmm.
That new economical model, like we're kind of wanting to inquire about a different economical model that would be grounded in new ways to assess value. In a sense that some of the people who bring value today, the most value, like nurses, teachers, are not the most paid. So we can see there's a gap, something's not working there, right?
Or
And
even
so
all the people who are not paid at all, mothers and all the work that is being done outside the economic system and not valued economically. Yeah.
so we would want to kind of have a new something that would be that would go beyond capitalism and socialism, that kind of dichotomy, that duality, but
Mm-hmm.
ground in a new way to assess value, what we bring, value we bring in society into the
Mm-hmm.
world. So that's, and we really want to say this is our position. This is what we hope to kind of like, and the work we do is to basically advocate, practice, experiment, readjust,
Mm-hmm.
research. But there is a dimension of really kind of like trying it out, because these are wonderful, grandiose ideas, but ideas are cheap and implementation is very hard and
Mm-hmm.
costly.
Yeah.
Costly, not just money, but costly in our being, because it requires us to let go of the past to be able to implement something truly different.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was so much again in what you just shared, but I want to emphasize this aspect that I see that this materialistic narrative is coming to an end. And for many people, they either consciously or subconsciously recognize that. Charles Eisenstein speaks of how our institutions are hollowing out. And a lot of people just don't believe in our political or economic leaders anymore. And I think a big part of that is because there is no real vision or visionary capacity in their leadership anymore. That somehow the story of more of the same is just not convincing anymore. And more people realizing, no, we're not just getting more material abundance with every generation. We've come to a peak and move beyond that peak, even so that especially the new generation is very disillusioned by the leadership of our society. And I shared with you in our last call that in 2009, I was part of what turned out to be a very formative gathering for me, this Renaissance 2 World Shift Leadership Summit in Perpignan. And I found it so interesting, such a beautiful synchronicity that I was involved with Renaissance 2 and now you project named Second Renaissance. So there is something that already has been connecting us on an idea level, and you've been picking up that reference. And so if we look at a bit more at that analogy of the Second Renaissance, an analogy to the first Renaissance, I think one of the great contributions that you're bringing is not to create a new movement, but making more accessible, visible, which movement is already existing, and bringing together, like, from what I know about the Renaissance, this awareness that, oh, there's something happening and there are many people coming from different directions, but contributing to a new vision of this world. And you've been very beautifully already pointing to some of the elements in terms of religion and capitalism and things that you are envisioning differently. But I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the link with the first Renaissance and the second Renaissance and how that idea came about.
Basically, for me, I always had a very deep connection to the first Renaissance because my mom was a tour guide in museum, and she'd take me to the museum and tell me all about Leonardo da Vinci. And I was so moved by the beauty of those paintings that had such a connection to a sense of life and movement. And I was also given the context that they arise right before a dark age, where things were very constrained and there was the collapse of the medieval time. And right before we were talking about how sometime before a great moment of change and taking on inner transformation, we have to touch a crisis. And I touch a crisis myself, where basically in 2019, I became a mother for the first time. And I was participating in a contemplative activism group. And I was given this kind of prophecy of basically system collapse, where there would be, failures of crops, which leads to famine, which leads to war. And I was just holding my 3 months old son. And I was like, oh, but war means we send men and young men to
Mm.
die. And that was right before the Ukraine war happened, or COVID happened, um, or the Israel-Palestine 7 October happened. And I really was very hard for me to sit with being a mother and not being able to fulfill on my first job, which is to provide safety for my child. And sitting with that, I had to go through looking at ways to navigate this crisis. And one way for me was to kind of look at the past, to look at the past and see, okay, I am not special. Me, Sylvie, going through a crisis and nothing special. There has been other moments for sure of great crisis in the world where mothers had to send their son to war. And where can I find, lessons from my ancestors? And so looking at the past, I reopened the box and I was like, oh my God, we talk about the first Renaissance as being this kind of like booming revolution, but it was also a very tumultuous time. I mean, if you really read about it, like there was, plots, assassination attempt, but also right before there was in the medieval dark age, where, a third of the Florentine population died. And I was like, oh my
Mm.
God, maybe we're going for a similar thing, which is there's a collapse of a system and a vacuum happens. And then when a vacuum happens, a dominant system no longer has authority. One thing is to hold on to the past. And so in the past, you had the Inquisition. And you see a bit, for example, what's happening with like extreme right coming up, what's going on with Trump and etc. It's like holding on to the past really tight,
Mhm.
reaction to that collapse. And another one, which is like wanting the system to collapse. I like, I'm going to dance on the dead body of my ancestors because I hold so much hurt from them. And like these two kind of getting at
Mm.
each other. And I was like, oh, that has happened before. This is nothing new. Like we've gone through that. It's not exactly the same, but it rhymes. There's a similar
Mhm.
pattern. And like, oh, well, what you just said, there is no new political vision. There is nothing that kind of moves us and gives us hope to kind of look forward and with this vacuum. And so for me, it was kind of seeing like, oh, we've gone through that. We had also great moments of like crisis and collapse, but also in those moments of like the composting, the death of something, there's birth and death often coexist together. Now, we might, in the overall picture, we
Mm.
might focus on the death and the era and the breakdown of an era, but they might be like little seeds of blooming that are coming. And I want to focus on like, what do I want to transmit to the next generation? I
Mm.
want to see like, okay, how can I make the next generation more resilient? How can I make myself more resilient? What do I want to transmit in the sense that I don't want the next generation to throw the baby with the bathwater, that they hold so much anger and resentment towards us that some of our valuable wisdom does not get to transmit. And because for me, wisdom, when I think of wisdom and a person who is wise, is a person who can bridge the past to the future, is a person who
Mm.
has lived and experienced and can bridge those two worlds and heal the relationship between those two worlds. And that people respect to having that ability. And so for me, therefore, I was like, okay, we had this one cycle, and why name second Renaissance? Is that instead of also maybe coming with a new term that is kind of doesn't mean like does not have a lot of history or meaning, is saying yes, we're building on the shoulder of our ancestors. And first Renaissance with the discovery of classic ancient classical Greek philosophy, and the second Renaissance might be the rediscovery in ancient wisdom traditions from Buddhism, from the East, or shamanism. But similarly, instead of like the West kind of in a way having this colonial conquering of the rest of the world, is that these other tradition comes into the West and nourish the West, and then there might hopefully be more harmony. And then I discovered that Frank Varela was
Mm.
also using that term, and I was like, oh, and it also Beyonce's tour was called
Mm.
Renaissance. And, when several people use the same term, you're like, we're on the wave. There's a wave of like
Mm.
Renaissance
Mhm.
rebirthing. Um, and so, yes, for me, it's really this focusing on like, what do we want to cultivate? What do we want to give birth to? And and in this sense of continuation and not rupture, like an evolution and transformation, but to no longer have that we have to cut the head of our ancestors with a bloody revolution, but being like, okay, some things needs to
Mm.
compost and some things we want to take with us and
Mm.
honor our past of the first Renaissance. Because I do come from a position of living in the West, being quite westernized. And so I am speaking to that lineage, but I also want to heal and honor.
Mm. Mhm. Beautiful. Yeah, I love, and I get more about you how a lot of the work that you're doing is about creating these synthesis of the integration of the transcend and include, and not creating more polarity, but seeing what is actually the common denominator at a higher level of evolution. And I'm curious to speak a bit more about the role of art. And I know very little about art history specifically, and also that episode of the Renaissance. So if we look at the role that art played in that time, can you give me an example of how art contributed to that cultural evolution that was happening and that shift around that time? What was the
Yeah,
role of
well,
art?
art is the making of is a one way of embodying culture,
Mm.
and I'd like to broaden what we think of art. Like mostly today we think of art as a painting or installation or God knows, but movies today is the very popular form of art. The ways
Mm.
like theater was, and they're ways to embody the culture, to vehicle and to communicate. And I have a sense that the space, this emerging space of the Second Renaissance, has a very strong intellectual flavor, and that's very normal. And because sometimes it first comes from like uh, sensing something, and also understanding intellectually understanding something. But I'm particularly interested in how to embody it, and my practice is partially through art. And what would art that really values interbeing look like?
Mm. Mhm.
What does art that really values spirituality look like? You know, are there artists that currently exist that are already kind of sensing into that field? Maybe they don't even know about Second Renaissance, Meta Modern.
Mm.
And I would say that that's kind of the case.
Mhm.
Like, if you look at art history, for example, you know, I would say Picasso, we think of Picasso as a modern artist, but really, in my view, he's a postmodern artist in a sense that what was Picasso and the futurists doing? In his painting, you had multiple perspectives because you had one portrait and you had the perspective of her face on one flat dimension,
Mm.
which is
Mhm.
postmodernity as a value system has that real sense of like being able to have multiple perspective, which is an amazing kind of progress and dimension, or of perceiving reality, right? And
Mhm.
uh, and similarly, like when you kind of sense, like you look at Duchamp, that says, oh, it's no longer art is just in what the artist does. It's like there's no beauty anymore. Beauty does not matter. It's in the eye of the beholder. Is that form of like that sense of nihilism also is starting to kind of exist in art, like that there's no
Mhm.
more beauty, that actually the art world has become very secular. You no longer see religious painting anymore. Lots of things that you kind of see in art museums. Now, I would
Mm.
say that, for example, in popular culture, um, the Matrix would be maybe something a bit second Renaissance metamodern because it's inquiring about the nature of reality and consciousness.
Mhm.
And, the movie that came out very recently, about a year, who won an Oscar, everything. What's the name? Oh,
Everything Everywhere All at Once. Yeah.
yes.
Mhm.
That it would be for me quite second Renaissance metamodern because it inquires again about the nature of reality and consciousness. And the end of the movie specifically is
Mm.
going against nihilism, is a sense of hope.
Mhm.
I would
Mhm.
say a bracket of like a bit too much violence for my personal
Yeah,
stance, like putting that level
agree.
of violence into my conscious awareness. But the
Mhm.
message, inquiry, um, certain artists like uh, Marina Abramovic, who performance art that is really breaking down what we originally conceive as art, that really
Mhm.
deep, like has a connection with the audience. Kiefer, that really kind of reintegrates a sense of spirituality, um, and religion again, with a deep inquiry. Um, so I would say you kind of see in actually existing artists, they might not know about metamodern and second Renaissance and the emerging field, but artists generally have
Mhm.
a sensibility. Um, but I'm particularly interested in like consciously being like, okay, there's these kind of value system or
Mhm.
aspiration, how to embody them, both in how we make art, what do we communicate, because art makes meaning. Art, what is art is making meaning,
Mhm.
is telling stories that gives us a sense of belonging, gives us a sense of identity. It's touching our heart, is allowing us to have a sense of identity that goes deeper than the rational, logical brain, that moves us. And I think therefore it's culture making, and an important, crucial element of culture making.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah. It's interesting. I noted as a hypothesis, as an answer to my question when I thought about it yesterday, that probably when people are more naturally surrounded by a representation of a different worldview that art can depict, then that can act as a gravitational force or a new center of gravity, just as being surrounded by a capitalistic system in a way aligns you with the capitalistic values. If you are surrounded by art that represents a possibility of a different world, that aligns you more with the values that are represented in the art. And you mentioned this example of having multiple perspectives representing a more complex evolution of our world view. And so I think there's a deep transformative power in art in that sense. Also on a
yes,
collective level, not just on an individual level, but really creating a collective field.
yes.
Mm.
In a way, art is often a reflection of our society. There's a lot of like financial speculation around art, which is just a reflection of our
Mhm.
society. And vice versa. It's like, okay, if we're trying to put a new paradigm, then what art would help foster that new paradigm? You know, and and I have a deep thing. It's like maybe the art of the future to us might not look like art.
Mm.
The
Mhm.
Duchamp, now we go in museum and you see Duchamp and it's like, that's art. And, people 100 years before Duchamp would be like, there's no way this is art. And similarly, you know, a lot of artists are interested in ritual making, and, hundreds like, there's no way this is art. This is just some kind of like woo woo shamanism, God knows, but I think it's also really inquiring
Mm.
about what is the function of art, what is the function of the artist
Mhm.
in today's context, because
Mhm.
things are always contextual. And I think like one key thing is to link people again, and to reconnect to that sense of wisdom, interbeing, spirituality, um, and inner growth.
Mhm. Mhm. For me, as a layman recipient of art, one of the most powerful experiences that I've had were those when I had the sense of a direct transmission of the state that the artist was in when they created it. And so, especially with psychedelic or visionary art, I have had these experiences, but yeah, in that sense, I can see how art can shift our state of consciousness temporarily and create these peak moments of revelation of like, ah, I get it. I feel what the artist has been feeling as they were creating it. And that can be an impulse to then go on that journey of how can I stabilize these temporary peak states and move into a more permanent stage of consciousness. And so I see this, yeah, massive paradigm shift that you also spoke into, from separation to interbeing and from competition to more cooperation. And I call these people who are pioneering this path the soul awakened leaders, as the name of this podcast. And to me, these are the visionaries who embody this new worldview and artists speaking from this more beautiful world that our hearts know is possible are certainly the torchbearers of that new world and play a very, very important role. I'm curious on your perspective on that impact on an individual level that art can have.
Yes, I think it can have a huge impact on the individual level. And actually, I'm also curious about um, art to operate no longer as an individual, but more as a collective level.
Mm-hmm.
Because that is also kind of going beyond the value of individuality. Look at my art, my expression, my thing. It's like, okay, how, both in the practice of like actually being with others, but also not repressing the uniqueness of the individual, but hard to be part of a collective. Um, the other part for me is also an art that goes beyond secularity, that start to heal, like, okay, that art spiritual. And I would even that is art is also political and
Mm-hmm.
religious. Like, for example, Joseph Beuys is like an extraordinary artist in the sense that, he was really behind the ecological movement in Germany. That he started to kind of like the kind of art justice in art, and no, it's like politics. And I say, because this idea of separation is a concept is not true. Things are not separated. It's not like your right arm functions without your left arm, and and like
Mm-hmm.
uh, and also understanding the delicate dance uh, of walking those things, and specifically, I would say that it's particularly maybe slippery in the past when, for example, politics infiltrated the religious sphere, and politics infiltrated the artistic sphere that becomes therefore propaganda. But I
Mm-hmm.
think it's different if, for example, spirituality, my individual practice, then goes into religion, which is I find others to practice with me. And our connection then goes into how we do politics differently because we relate to one another. So I think there's also the direction. It's like
Mm-hmm.
not politics into religion, but like spirituality and religion being together, being linked to something bigger than itself, influence how we can do politics, therefore more connected, more wisely, and vice
Mm-hmm.
versa. For politics going into arts, which is to create, very effective posters and graphic design to forward a political message, is the other way around. Like, oh, what would be politics that is moved by life, that is moved by the beauty and the wholeness of life, that has
Mm-hmm.
an artistic sensibility. I think I think it's a, I'm trying to make that point because I know that for many people, we still have a lot to heal from the trauma of the past, of
Mm-hmm.
having experienced the Inquisition. And that also, if we don't heal from that, that restricts our ability to innovate, our ability to experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
I very much agree that this is influencing us strongly on a collective level, but also on an individual level, even just from a psychological developmental perspective. As children, our parents were our gods, and if we haven't healed our relationship with our parents, we'll naturally have a hesitation to turn towards God if we haven't replaced this God image with something that is more accurate, more up to date to where we are today. So I feel that before we can actually transcend and move into a new form of spirituality, a new religion, we actually need to bow down backwards and see how can we heal the wound that we have in our individual lives with our parents, for example, as a representation of God.
Exactly. And there's always this interaction of like individual and collective. It's like, I tend to say, you know, if we haven't healed our blueprint relationships, which is our relationship with our parents, there's tends to be kind of two reactions. Like either I'm going to try to be like them, right? Because they were heroes and gods. It's like, oh, I want to, or I have such it's a fallen god. I have such a distaste for them. I will try to do everything possible to not be like them. But actually, in that reactivity, you still own and possess and don't have freedom to really be yourself. You're still locked into that. And there's no true freedom and exploration and innovation. You're always in kind of reaction to it, and therefore not fully mature as a grown adult, a human being. And that's similar. That's on the individual basis. That's why sometimes we say with people who work with us, it's like your relationship to your parents matters to us because it will show up, in how you relate one another. The other thing is also on the collective level. Therefore, what is in a collective level, that will be our relationship to the state, to okay, the state is corrupt, we can't trust politicians, and that will create a reactivity to any, and throw the baby with the bathwater. What is politics? Politics is doing things together, right? And it's like doing things of collection, action problems, synchronizing. And it's hard. And that means if you don't trust politics, you're really saying, I don't trust my fellow citizen. Like that's the root of it. And then if you're constrained with that view, with that traumatic past of sensing you can't trust one another, then it restricts hugely the level of social innovation that you can have. It's and so similarly, like when, for example, how you show up in your at being at service, your shadows, not your individual shadows, but our collective shadows. So our reaction to authority, our reaction to leadership, our sense of oppression, like all that plays out, and it's important to healing. It's very important to heal that, because otherwise we have it's not really a new future. It's just more trauma transmission.
Yeah, that really lands. What inspires me about you is that you're not just a bright mind who has gone really deep into the analysis and gone really radical into what has caused the state of the world, but you've also taken a very pragmatic approach of creating experiments towards a solution. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your experience with creating these hubs and co-living spaces, because I can imagine that these are little microcosms where exactly the things that we've just been talking about show up and offer you an opportunity to create new prototypes of how could it actually be in an ideal world.
Well, so we have currently one hub in Bergerac, where people get to come for a week, a month, 3 months, and they get to practice conscious co-living. And why we say conscious co-living is that there's this sense of awareness of what you're doing. And there's a framework, and the framework is fascinating because that will allow things to emerge. And to maybe be a bit more specific, usually maybe you've gone on retreat and you've done 1 week retreat and you come back and you're like, oh my God, that was amazing, right? Met these amazing people, we're like brothers and sisters. And we've observed that actually often we recommend for people to stay at least a month, about 3 weeks. Why? Because first week, you're like, yay! Second week, there's going to be real tension arriving. Why? Because your individualism is going to start really coming up. I don't want to wake up at that time to do collective care. I have a meeting. I don't feel like, having a sharing circle because I need time for myself. And like, this is where things are going to start rubbing. And so
Mm,
often, if you've only done 1 week retreat, you would have never had gone through the difficult period where the growth happens, where the conflict arises. And why we say 3 weeks, because then you have time to kind of maybe start going through those conflict with others, but also looking into yourself. How much have I integrated my sense of individualism, maybe my sense of like uh, fear of the others, my like whatever goes on. And then you have time to also start healing that, move
mm,
past that, see the opportunity beyond those friction. And
mm,
it's been very fascinating at the hub that there's usually, regardless who's holding the space, there is usually some moments of friction because we in the West are such individualist animals that we don't
mm,
know how to live with one another anymore.
mhm,
And therefore, the hub is a great way to practice a bit and to see what comes up and to be like, okay, I got these shadows to transform.
mhm,
That's how I show up in the collective. And this is also my strength. Um, and so we think that it's a great container for people to experiment without having to make a long-term commitment. For
mhm,
example, people might really dream of wanting to create their own eco villages with, a business partner. And it's a great way to kind of try it out without, a dating, to try it out to be like, actually, do I want to do it? What is our strengths? What is our weakness?
mhm,
We're not saying how we run this collective, this space is the way of running it. Um, there's many ways of running it, but we have specific things that allows to kind of like notice our patterns
mm,
and
mhm,
and contain the suffering, because many of us come also because we sense that there is something that has is not working and there is
mhm,
suffering.
mhm,
Heal that suffering, and we can only do it with others. We cannot heal our suffering alone. That's also one thing that is amazing to do that
mhm,
process collective. Is there are
mhm,
certain things that you can only heal with others.
mhm. Yeah, beautiful. Mm. I'm curious, with that all in place, my sense is that you are, in a way, also constantly creating new things. And I'm wondering, what is something that you are desiring to create next? And yeah, for you and for life itself, what are things that you have in the making currently?
So for me individually, there's a real desire to focus on the art of the Second Renaissance, to form an art collective and
Mm,
find fellow artists who aspires for that. There's also continuing investing in the Bergerac Hub because it's a great way to meet others. And why I do that is because personally, I have a dream of like a conscious neighborhood, to live into a
mm,
neighborhood where people really want to do that type of work,
mhm,
because also, lastly, the first Renaissance happened with pockets. So Florence was a pocket, for example. You had certain pockets in different parts of Europe where you had people who were interested in like new ideas that kind of live quite proximately in certain cities. Um, so, like actually you had the birth of Protestantism with Calvin, but they tend to be in one region, right?
mhm,
And
mhm,
we want to form pockets. Like first it might be just like, in a town, a few houses that people can come together, because virtuality has made things so accessible. Like you and I are in completely different continent and we get to connect. But human beings are still human beings, body. What differentiates
mhm,
us from the AI is our body, partially is our animality, our need to be in the body. What differentiates from AI is our desire, our need for consciousness awareness, that we are capable of awareness. And we do that with others. We're not isolated. We don't become aware isolated. We become aware with others. And so you need pockets where people come together physically to kind of like experience that new culture. As you said, it's like you're in a new water. You want to be with lots of other fish who wants to swim in that water,
Mhm.
and that create that water with you to make you feel one, it's possible. So you're not depressed and desperate and think like, oh my God, this is never going to happen. And two, to make that ecosystem more and more gradually robust. So those pockets can be like, oh, just a group of a few people living together, but gradually it becomes like a whole town and then a whole region. And then eventually, like once you have enough pockets that also connect to one another, like you can flip. But we like what I want is like, for example, a neighborhood, because when I am with other people who believe like me that a second renaissance is possible, it it nourishes me deeply and it helps
Mm.
me, and because we believe together. And why I say neighborhood, because I'm also aware that because of my modern individualist heritage, I can't do full on co-living 24/7 with kids and the family and etc. A neighborhood is more adjusted to where my level of development and preference are. And I would say that's quite realistic, I believe, for Westerners individual than like full on co-living. Now, co-living is a great experience, but as my overall life, I think neighborhood is more realistic and
Mhm.
psycho emotionally sustainable, and is
Mhm.
to form pockets and links those pockets together so that we sense that we're together in this.
Mhm. Beautiful. My next question would have been exactly in that direction. What is your global vision of all the beautiful work that so many of us are doing coming to fruition? But I think that is all, at least an important part of that answer, of these small pockets interconnecting and then creating bioregions or ecosystems that are interconnected and sharing that vision through more and more lived experiences with other people. Is there anything else that you would share as this, yeah, global
Yeah,
vision of where all this could lead us?
I would encourage everybody, first to maybe just check a place. Like, of course, I have an affinity with the hub in particular and etc. But there's, I think, other spaces online and physical. That's why we created this ecosystem mapping so that people have a sense of who is in the space, who's doing
Mm.
what
Mhm.
because if you're trying to navigate somewhere, an unknown land, a map is damn useful. Now, it's not the thing in itself, but it helps you navigate. And
Mhm.
the point is, yes, like you want to start increasing the level of interaction with the people who um, believe like you. So that can be collaborating together, working together, or living in closer neighborhood. These things help you to kind of maintain yourself echo spiritually. And then also financially, because you might help each other de-risk, because living into an alternative path often is difficult because that switch often has an economical impact for certain people. Um, so yeah, I would say like, maybe discovering some and trying it out, but you need to be with your brothers and sisters in arms, because
Mm.
individually, like we're a lot weaker than we believed, like we're given the belief.
Mhm.
We
Mhm. Yeah. What is your biggest challenge in what you're currently creating, if you're willing to share?
My biggest challenge, um, so currently, one is that I had encountered breakdowns in the past, and is to not put the past into the future. So
Mm.
to have learned the lesson of like, why did I had, for example, breakdowns? What is it, the lessons to be learned? but to not think that, oh, that automatically means that there will
Mm.
also have a future. So like
Yeah.
I gotta heal my little ghost, otherwise my ghost hunt me, and then I cut
Mhm.
off possibilities. And like concretely, for example, living in co-living had been very difficult for me,
Mm.
and I grew a lot from it. And so one healing journey for me was to not just say never again, like done with that, but to be like,
Mhm.
okay, some things didn't work. This is why I learned. This is why I'm taking from, but not to go into never again, and to not live into the
Mhm.
fear of that happening again, and to trust the lesson and the solidity that I have built with that experience. And that I can also share and transmit and hopefully save some others, unnecessary pain.
Mhm.
uh, and the biggest that would be that, because I can keep noticing sometimes that little ghost coming to me, being like, oh, like, are you sure? Are you sure? And be like, no, it's fine. Don't project the
Mm.
past. Sure.
Mhm.
Like it doesn't make you. It's a different. You're a different person, and this is a different context.
Mhm. Beautiful. Yeah, I can resonate that with that in my own experience. And I was saying coaching, you can only guide others as deeply as you've gone yourself. And I feel that you've gone very deep in order to also be a way shower for others and show others the path into a different future that we're living into personally in our own biographies, but also collectively. And that even though we have some really dark shadows collectively in our past that we don't want to repeat, it's not necessary. We have transcended that and we can move into a new timeline where actually we can live more harmoniously with our global brothers and sisters, with nature and with the animals and the non-human beings. So yeah, I think that's a
It's
beautiful aspiration and belief
a
to
bit
live
like
into.
falling in love and you got your heart broken and you're like, I'm never gonna love
Mhm.
again. Starting to fall in love again, and you're like, oh my God, is it gonna end badly? The thing is, if you keep living is in the fear of it's gonna end badly, you're likely gonna cause it to make it end badly. And so you gotta watch yourself
Mhm.
to reproduce like that mindset, that pattern that you create the prophecy of versus
Mhm.
how it actually is. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, this is what I see in how I show in my biggest challenge, because I have a deep longing to live um, in a kind of neighborhood, more in community, and I'm aware that I have shadows about being in collective, and
Mhm.
so I just gotta like make peace with my little ghost.
Mhm. Yeah. And as I'm reflecting on my own journey, I wouldn't have had that capacity in my darkest moments to see that way. But if I look back now at my life, even in the most difficult and painful and terrifying moments, I would not want to change any of that, because I know that I've become who I am today because especially of the difficult experiences. They have shaped me in a way. And so in this way, making peace with my past and acknowledging that that is such an important part of my path, I don't want to experience that again, but I know that it was necessary for me at a time. It's not necessary for me anymore, but it shaped who I am today. And so I see this thread that is weaving through our conversation as well, that we need to make peace with the past collectively as well and acknowledge the beautiful work that our ancestors have done, and to let go and move into something new that it's time for.
Because otherwise you can't love yourself. If you can't
Mhm.
be okay with your past, there's no way
Yeah.
you're actually okay with right now,
Hmm. Yeah.
because you are who you are right now because of your
Hmm.
past. And we
Yeah.
gotta make, because there's a reason there's all these stories of being haunted by ghosts. That's people who hasn't made peace with their past, and
Mhm.
individually and collectively. And that's why I say that one big art thing for me is doing a funeral or requiem for a passing age, that
Mm. Mhm.
from modernity. Like it was a big era, Like why
Mhm.
there's
Mhm.
so much also shame for a lot of Westerners about colonialism, about, even the first Renaissance or our current value
Mhm.
system is not at peace with it. We're ashamed, we're not proud. And I'm not saying, oh, you gotta be blindly proud, but just take
Mm-hmm.
ownership, full ownership. Yes, there are things that
Mm-hmm.
weren't bright, but also there were wonderful things in it. And you can't look at yourself and love
Mm-hmm.
yourself. Therefore, you can't know how to love your future, your children. Like if you can't look at yourself with love and grace.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for me, ideally, such a funeral would have both the acknowledgement of the beautiful things and the great accomplishments and the forgiveness. Forgiveness in the sense of letting go the hope for a better past, really coming to terms with the past as it were, in order then to be able to move on.
And acknowledging the horrors of it. Forgiveness is
Mm-hmm.
not like getting, is
Mm-hmm.
acknowledging horror, but forgiving. Forgiving is to give anew, to
Mm-hmm.
give a
Mm-hmm.
you cannot have a future if there's not that sense of giving a new chance.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's and forgiveness is for me it was a very is a very hard practice, and is at moments it was extremely hard for me to practice forgiveness to others and to myself. And actually recently it's only through actually praying and asking forgiveness and asking to help me forgive what I can't forgive, because sometimes certain things feel so big to forgive.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How can and it's too big for our own little person or our own ego to kind of forgive that immensity or to handle that amount of suffering. And that's why I also talk about going to connecting to something bigger than ourselves, that it's maybe not some it's not just me, Sylvie, and there's something that is capable of more love than what I'm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe it's just a future version of you that you're in contact with already. Beautiful.
For this
Yeah.
very deep and beautiful exchange.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like we're coming to a natural ending. I'm curious if there's anything else that is on your mind that you would like to share before we close.
I'd just like to let people know that um, there is hope.
Mm, beautiful. I love that.
Even regardless of the storm that comes,
Mm,
there's because there is life. Life is powerful and strong.
mm,
We are strong. You millions of years of life for us to be here. We're not little things flying in the wind. No,
mm.
life is strong.
We have life itself on our side. And on that note, I'm curious, what is something that you're currently working on that you would maybe like support with if anyone hears that? And how can people best get in touch with you and the work that you're doing?
Well, people can check secondrenaissance.net, where we are starting some connection calls so they can meet other like-minded people, people who are interested in this sphere. Uh, there's the newsletter that keeps up to date, but there's lots of different things that they can interact with to kind of like get to know the space more. Some people here might already know the space very well, and as I say, I'm particularly interested in art of the Second Renaissance, with starting in publishing a magazine of the Second Renaissance with a strong focus around
Mm,
art. Um, so always looking for collaborators. Uh, and yeah, like if people want to, there's so many plates I'm spinning. And if people ever are thinking of coming around Europe or are in Europe, coming to the hub,
mm.
I always enjoy meeting other like-minded people.
Great. Yeah, I can definitely recommend these community calls for life itself. I've only made it to one so far, but it's been a really beautiful experience, and I definitely intend to join future ones. And I'll put all the resources, the links to the things that you just mentioned into the show notes.
Mhm.
Sylvie, thank you so much. It's been such a life-giving conversation. I feel energized and have more energy now after our call than before. That is always a good sign for me. Thank you so much for the beautiful work that you're doing, and I'm sure we'll find more ways to weave our work together.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Thank you for tuning in to the Soul Awakened Leadership Podcast. You will find all the links and information on today's guest in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend who might benefit from the insights. Make sure to subscribe and leave a comment or review on Spotify or any of the platforms. If you would like to find out more about my work or connect, you can visit jonathanclaude.com, that is JonathanKlaudt.com, or find me at Jonathan Claude on Instagram or Facebook.